the Omega Metroid Podcast. My name is Andy Spiteri, as always, joined by Kodlaski. Dak, how are you on this wonderful day? Busy day.
Very busy day, especially for those of us who enjoy a little Zelda, for sure. For those of us who enjoy Metroid,
Yes.
It's just another day. Another day of suffering. But for Zelda fans, awesome announcement today, and otherwise, I'm doing pretty good. It was a nice 3-day weekend with Labor Day, so I was able to enjoy that, did a little streaming. Been playing some Super Mario Sunshine. I'm thinking about speedrunning this game, which I'm excited about. And I got a new mouse, as I was just telling you before the stream, which I'm also very excited about. And I don't know, life's pretty good right now. All things considered, life's pretty good. How are you doing?
Yeah, man, it's been a crazy day. I was so busy this morning with the news of Hyrule Warriors: Age of Calamity. I am super excited about that. I'm in a fired up mood. I'm ready to talk about that at length, which I will be doing later this week over on our Zelda show, the Champions Cast. We're even going to release that episode a little bit early, so if you want to check it out, it should be available probably like Friday or so. But yeah, man, anytime that you get these announcements out of nowhere, out of thin air, and you wake up to a new Zelda game or just a new Nintendo game, you know that it's going to be a good day, had a good weekend, and all the excitement with today's announcement aside, I was really looking forward to talking about what we are here to talk about today, and that is the intertwined history of retro studios and the crazy, unbelievable, true story of the development of Metroid Prime. And we're going to get into that unbelievable tale. We're going to have a little bit of story time today. But before we get there, Dak, I did want to just spend a minute talking about the release of Hyrule Warriors for today and what that means for the rest of Nintendo's 2020 lineup. Because now we see their holiday lineup kind of taking shape. We've got Mario All-Stars in September. We've got Pikmin in October. We've got Hyrule Warriors in November. Really, there's only kind of the December slot to fill out here. And then, that's probably going to be it for the rest of the year. Are you thinking that today's announcement has any impact on these rumors of the rumors that we've heard bandied about of this new 2D Metroid that's going to release in 2020? Do you think it's still possible, or is kind of the window tightening for that release?
I can't believe that Nintendo's really going to get away going through this year with releasing 3 games. They've pulled it off. I gotta hand it to them. I don't know, because I saw a tweet on Twitter earlier today that was talking about from Imran Khan, who is from Game Informer, or ex-senior editor of Game Informer. Okay, well, either way, he was talking about how this is likely the last thing we're really seeing for the rest of the year. This is probably it, aside from maybe, a small announcement here or there, maybe one more game. So in terms of that, I'm wondering, well, how does Nintendo view something like, obviously, Metroid Prime Trilogy? Immediately, I was like, well, if this is all they have planned for the rest of the year, there's no way that they're going to release Metroid Prime Trilogy in 2020. It's not going to happen. But then, when I saw that tweet, I was thinking, well, knowing Nintendo, they probably consider Metroid Prime Trilogy to be a small thing. For us, it's a pretty big deal, but for them, Metroid's not a priority, and I don't think Trilogy is a priority for them either. So I could think...
I would go, I'm sorry to interrupt, I would go so far as to even say I think a new 2D Metroid might not be a big deal for them. I think Metroid Prime would be a big deal, but yeah.
I think the only thing that's probably a big deal for them in terms of Metroid is Metroid Prime 4. So in terms of the trilogy, I could see it being released this year if they consider it a small thing. They just shadow drop it and they're oh yeah, Metroid Prime Trilogy come out in December. I could 100% see that happening, because to them it's no big deal. For us it's a big deal, but for them it's kind of, it's a pittance. It's nothing. That being said,
right.
I think this does kind of round out what we're going to see from Nintendo throughout the rest of the year. Even though this is a quote-unquote spin-off or whatever, this is definitely, as far as Nintendo is concerned, a pretty major Zelda release, right? So I would consider it a pretty major game release overall for them. So I don't know what else they're really going to try to stack up in that area of the year, considering they really haven't stacked up any games in the rest of the year previously. So Yeah, I mean, off that tweet, I was thinking, oh, maybe we just won't get Trilogy till 2021. But at the same time, I could really see them just shadow dropping Prime Trilogy, and I hate the word shadow dropping, just dropping it, whatever, um, and just releasing it like with no fanfare whatsoever, like 3 weeks before it actually comes out or whatever it is. Or maybe not even doing an announcement. So I don't know. It depends really on how Nintendo looks at it. If they consider it like a big enough deal as a game in and of itself, it probably will be coming in 2021. But I don't think they do. So yeah, maybe we could see them just randomly drop it towards the end of the year, just so they can get us Metroid fans to shut up. Who knows?
Well, so here's my thing. It's like, so we've seen Paper Mario, we've seen Pikmin, and now we've seen Hyrule Warriors, and even I guess Mario 3D All Stars, all kind of, for lack of a better word, shadow dropped or like very limited release windows. I think Paper Mario had 3 months. Hyrule Warriors is gonna have 2 months. Pikmin had about 3 months as well. So like, I feel like if they don't announce it by October, like probably the beginning or maybe mid October at the latest, like it ain't happening for the rest of the year. So I was thinking too, like, this, and you could tell just by the positioning of Hyrule Warriors, like in, the Black Friday kind of time slot. This is their big game, right? Like this is what they're putting their eggs in the basket behind.
Mm-hmm.
But like for the last couple of years, like there has been some pretty high profile December releases too, like Smash in 2018, Xenoblade in 2017. I guess there wasn't a whole lot for last year. I could be wrong, but it does make me think that like maybe there is something left in the tank for 2020, and hopefully that could be Metroid. But I feel a little bit less optimistic about 2D Metroid coming out in 2020 now than I did a month ago, just because of the arrival of Pikmin 3 in the October time slot. I think that would have been a really good time for a Metroid game to come out. December seems, I don't know. December doesn't seem super likely to me, but I guess we'll see. We will see.
Yeah, I mean, you look at it. I could see December for Trilogy because even though there are games coming out towards the end of the year, they aren't like they're still not like main games. Like it's not a main Zelda game. It is. I mean, I guess they kind of are treating it like one because it is directly tied to a main Zelda game, but it is still like a spin-off. Pikmin 3 is a port. Um, so I don't know. Maybe they will just port it over and be like, hey, whatever, just get it done with. But I would like to think that they would put a little more fanfare into it. In the Super Mario 3D All Stars, that's another port. Um, so who knows? It's hard to know when like Nintendo like makes moves in silence. Essentially, like we really don't know like what their game plan is, what their vision is, what they are trying to do. So they just kind of do stuff for the. And I think the Age of Calamity, like Hyrule Warriors, is a really cool idea. I'm not a huge Warriors fan, and I didn't play Hyrule Warriors already. I think there were two, right? I don't know. There was DLC or something. I haven't played any of it, but the lore implications and actually, wow, Breath of the Wild, but with plot is enticing to me. So I'll probably check it out. But who knows? Maybe this is like Nintendo's just last hurrah for the rest of the year. Maybe they still have something in store for us. I think if they do, they won't tell us until they actually drop it. So it's all speculation.
And I guess to kind of counteract the point I just made, we had Mario 3D All Stars with like literally 2 weeks of build up. So these crazy bastards could do anything. I hope you're right. I would hope that they would give Metroid Prime Trilogy and especially a new 2D Metroid a little bit more runtime or like chance for people to get excited about it. I think that you could probably drop Trilogy on the Switch and like have a shorter release span because enough people know Metroid Prime, enough people know that it's associated with like these really high quality games. I think that would be okay, but like for a new game, man, I feel like you got to really kind of get the hype train rolling on that. This is the first new, like really brand new 2D Metroid since Metroid Fusion, pretty much. The rest have just been remakes. So yeah, we'll see how this kind of affects the rest of Nintendo's 2020 lineup. And again, if you want to check out my full thoughts on Age of the Calamity, check out the Champions Cast on Friday because we are going to be talking about it at length, and I'm super super excited about this release. And I'm with you. I wasn't a Hyrule Warriors guy, but the fact that this one actually has like kind of purpose and plot behind it instantly makes it more interesting to me.
Absolutely.
So yeah. Well, that's all the exciting news from today. But let's get into the real reason that we are here today, Dak. We have got one of those stories that sounds so crazy that it has to be true. It's kind of funny how like 20 years later we were talking about Metroid Prime 4, and there's this. I guess you could say it's a troubled development. It was originally in the hands of another developer, and then taken away, restarted, built from the ground up midway through development. We have no information on when this game is coming out. A lot of fans are very worried about Metroid Prime 4. But some of them are reassured because the property is back in the hands of Retro Studios. It all is kind of a nice like coming full circle moment to me, because it reminds me of the wild ride that we went through to get Metroid Prime 1 from Retro Studios almost 20 years ago at this point. So it's kind of crazy how we're almost back where we started.
Yeah, and I am very looking forward to the day when Metroid Prime 4 has been out, maybe for weeks, months, or years, maybe, and we learn about the actual development of the game. Like, if those rumors about like 5 different Namco Bandai development teams working on it at the time, and then it being dropped and then redone with Retro, I want to know the actual facts of it. It was all just reporting and speculation that eventually kind of became like truth, but we don't really know. So I am looking forward to finding out how the development of this game, especially since we barely know anything about it since its announcement years ago, how it ended up going once we've played it. Hopefully that it's a good game, and I'd want to know about the development, just like Metroid Prime was a great game despite its development, and we can now look back at it now, which I'm very looking forward to getting into that.
I would love, love, love if there was like a tell-all book about the Metroid Prime 4 development. That would be so awesome. Can you imagine if like poor Bandai Namco had nothing to do with Metroid Prime 4, but they've just kind of been like the kicking boys for this development restart for all these years? I think that'd be so funny.
Yeah, it definitely sounded like something that'd be plausible, and if it wasn't really, it was like out of their control, out of their hands, or they were just completely uninvolved, then I do feel bad for them. But hey, at least they were attached to Metroid Prime 4 in some respect, which I would consider an honor, no matter how it went down. So we'll see, but I think there's probably some truth in there, if not the entire truth. And I'm sure if it isn't, there was some inkling of truth into what we knew so far. So far, at the end of the day, I think it probably whatever happened, it's good that it happened because it ended up being with Retro, and hopefully the game turns out great. But their track record's been good, but we haven't seen Retro work on a Metroid game in a long time. It's a completely different studio at this point. I think it's really only familiar
Yeah.
by name at this point and location. So I really just want the game to come out, but I really would love to learn those details too.
Well, to get to where we're going, we have to learn from where we've been. So, Dak, let's kick off this story and tell everybody the incredible history of Retro Studios. Now, I want to give a shout out to a really incredible Polygon article. It was written by Blake Hester. It was published in 2018. He interviewed 10 former Retro employees. Some of them went on record, some of them spoke on condition of anonymity, but it is a fascinating look into the studio and everything surrounding the development of that game. And I can't encourage people to go and read that article enough. That's basically what we've based our narrative on here today, is that article and the stories that were told. So if you want to read it, go and check it out. I'll link it in the show notes. But yeah, this is pretty unbelievable, this story of how we got there. So I guess without further ado, I'll kind of start reading away here, and we can interject and talk about some of the different points in the beats and history of Metroid Prime.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so we have to go to 1998 to start off with, and we are going to meet a man named Jeff Spangenberg. Spangenberg, I think is his name. I think that's how you say it. If it's not, I'm sorry. Jeff
Spangenberg, yeah.
Spangenberg. Spangenberg? Okay. So Spangenberg formed Retro Studios on October 1st, 1998. That's my birthday, by the way.
Oh, happy
Not
birthday.
1998, but October 1st. He was originally an employee of Acclaim, and he worked on Turok, NBA Jam, and a bunch of other studios. He was a pretty wealthy guy. He was eventually laid off from Acclaim in 1998 and sued them and won a settlement from them and used the settlement money to form Retro Studios. Originally was working out of his garage, but very quickly he secured a deal with Nintendo of America and proceeded to build what sounds like a state-of-the-art studio. They had the first motion capture studio in Texas. They had movie theaters for showing off progress. They had 120 employees. This sounded like a real high-tech operation. You know, they went and got, it sounds like, the best of the best.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting when I reread this. First, I think it was the one of Austin, Texas's first motion capture stages, but nonetheless, what I thought was interesting was how he got the deal from Nintendo of America, right? Because later, what we
Yeah.
learn in the story, I don't want to spoil or anything, but the fact that Retro was almost completely disconnected from Nintendo of Japan, who is, the core of Nintendo game development, essentially. Not getting like a straight up deal with them, but getting it from Nintendo of America, who, as we all know, is essentially just a PR branch of the entire, of the American side of the Nintendo Corporation. That they got a deal with them and not with the main Nintendo of Japan company, I thought was interesting because they really put a lot of faith in Retro multiple times, and you'll hear that throughout the story multiple times, on a company that didn't really have a background to deserve or earn that, and was untested and unproven, hadn't shipped a game yet. Like, so there was a lot of faith that Nintendo put into the studio, not just throughout its history, but right at the get-go, and especially from the NOA branch and not the Nintendo of Japan branch. It really goes to show how they were looking to try and do something new, but also put a lot of faith somewhere that it really could have easily not worked out for them.
It's interesting too that Nintendo of America was involved in recruiting studios at all.
Mm-hmm.
To me, like it that just seems like something that Nintendo of Japan, where they're making the games, would have a more hands-on involvement with. So that stuck out to me as just kind of a strange little tidbit. And I was also like, I just wonder how that process works. Like, if you are a founder of a game studio and you've built a new studio, do you pitch Nintendo and say like, hey, I've got this great studio, we're working on these games, are you interested in an ownership stake? So very, very fascinating stuff, and I would love to learn a little bit more on like how that process actually works, because it just seems so odd to me.
You got to definitely spend money to make money. I'm sure the guy, once he created this whole thing, had, like you said, the first motion cap studio in Austin, Texas, had a huge facility, over 100 employees. In 19 or whatever, late 90s, early 2000s, you come to Nintendo with that, right? And they're obviously feeling great with the N64 and the Game Boy and all that. He probably had a really solid pitch. And considering that even that the studio didn't have experience, he did, right? And he could, cite successes in the industry prior to Retro, where that might have been enough for Nintendo's like, oh, successful game developer, new brand spanking new, brand Spangenberg studio, right in the States. And maybe that just would have been, that was just enough. Like, the stars align, and that was enough to convince them.
It seems like a pretty, not a rags to riches story, but it just seems pretty unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
So Retro was not bought out, but Nintendo secured a ownership stake in them for 15%, and Spangenberg started working on GameCube games, even though we're still in 1998. They were developing 4 games: NFL Retro Football, a car combat game called Thunder Rally, which almost made me think of like Rocket League, kind of like they were ahead of their time or something. I don't know. The infamous Raven Blade, which I think that everybody who's ever heard of Retro Studios knows a little bit about, and an Untitled action adventure game, which will be very important to the story a little bit later on. So everything seems hunky-dory. There's a really good buzz, high energy. However, by 2000, 2 years later, all 4 games had stalled and were nowhere near completion, in part because of the lack of GameCube development kits provided to Retro by both Nintendo and then the higher-ups at Retro,
Right.
and which leads into the second part, which was the mismanagement of the company, it sounds like. Now, from this article, it kind of implies that Spangenberg went in and kind of wanted to make Retro a little bit of a different feel studio. So we brought in some like people that were kind of into like tabletop RPGs and stuff like that to kind of bring a different take on what game development could be. But it sounds like it didn't really work, because a lot of these people weren't really attuned to what actually went into making like a video game on a video game console. So management repeatedly over and over again from the people that were interviewed in this article was cited as unfocused and just basically out to lunch.
Yeah, I don't think the idea of the fundamental idea of, finding people who aren't exactly from the industry or have different experiences is a bad one, but they need direction and guidance, right? And it definitely seemed like they were just kind of put
Right.
together like, okay, we have these Star Wars animators, we have these pen and paper tabletop guys, and we have people from the video game industry, we have people from my previous studio, from this studio and that studio. And put them all together sounds like a dream team, but then he just left, and just kind of like, all right, figure it out. Like I'm gonna go have some pool parties and drive around my Ferrari. So, which I
Yeah.
can't entirely blame him for that, but it definitely seemed like he was not exactly looking
Well,
too far forward.
we'll get to him in
Yeah,
a second.
yeah.
Old
But they
Spangenberg
definitely
here.
needed
We'll
some
get to
more
him.
guidance and leadership that just wasn't there.
Yeah, I actually agree. I think the idea of like bringing in unconventional people like from the tabletop world is like a really cool idea, but then you have to place them in the right roles.
Mm-hmm.
It just kind of sounds like they weren't placed in the right roles where their expertise could be applied in a way that really augmented the games instead of like, it sounds like it just actively detracted from them, particularly the point where they got their GameCube development kit and didn't know what to do with it, so it sat in their office for like months, it sounds like. So it's just kind of a cluster of errors. 2 years later in 2000, we really have nothing to show for the 2 years of development, the 2 years of salaries, and then Nintendo of Japan comes to pay a visit in the year 2000, and this was described as a bloodbath. And I would love to have been a fly on the wall
Mm-hmm.
to see this meeting take place. They didn't explicitly say who was there. They kind of implied that Shigeru Miyamoto made the trip, but basically Nintendo of Japan absolutely hated everything that Retro was doing. They thought that the games didn't fit into the Nintendo mold. They weren't impressed with the progress that was being made. There was nothing to show Nintendo for all of the years of development, and they basically gutted everything. They basically said you have to start from scratch. The only thing to make it out of this bloodbath was the untitled fourth game, the sci-fi action adventure game that allegedly was starring 3 female protagonists. Miyamoto suggested that they flip it and turn it into an idea he had, which was for a first-person Metroid game, and that was the direction that they went. They stopped working on all these other games. They focused entirely on what was going to be this new first-person Metroid, and the 3 games were canceled, and unfortunately, that meant that basically half of Retro Studios was laid off. The entire teams working on Retro Football and Thunder Rally, and then later, many of the Ravenblade team was laid off. Some of them were brought over to work on Metroid Prime, but at the time, I think Nintendo put out a presser that said, we've just released 26 employees and we're restructuring Retro Studios. So very, very tumultuous for the first couple of years here of Retro's existence.
Yeah, it was necessary though. I mean, the studio should never have been working on 4 games at once. And they weren't just working on 4 games at once. They were also building a proprietary engine to run those 4 games on. So in those 2 years, they not only had those 100 so employees split over 4 games, but they had an additional team that was working on a completely new engine to support and build those 4 other games. And I mean, that's a lot. There was way too much to begin with. A lot of it had to be cut down. Like this was, even though it was a bloodbath, it was so necessary. I mean, the studio would not have survived. They had way too much on their plate. They had way too much excess, way too much stuff that could be cut and was cut. So it was unfortunate for like the people who like were working there. Obviously, you never want to be in that situation. How they handled the cuts was pretty poor, but it was so necessary for them because the studio 100% would have gone under without that kind of guidance. I don't know if those 4 games would have ended up being successful. Clearly, there was some kind of plan because they were working on an NFL game, which they would have needed a license for. So, like, maybe, if anything, that was probably the only game that might have taken off a little bit. But yeah, it was something that was so desperately needed to happen for Retro, even though it was, a really bad situation. It was a blessing in disguise for them. because there was no way the studio would have survived. I doubt any of those 4 games would really ended up being good while being worked on simultaneously with all these other games and an engine and this and that. And I think, at the end of the day, Nintendo Japan showed up and was like a guardian angel for them, right? Like they they showed up and gave them the guidance they needed, gave them the focus they needed, had them just, trim the fat. And without that visit, which probably would have happened inevitably, but without that visit, I don't think we definitely wouldn't have seen the Metroid Prime series as it is. I don't think we would see Retro as it is. That was a pretty historic day, I'm sure, for the industry in general. And again, that goes back to how the deal was initially made with Nintendo of America and not Nintendo of Japan. Like, it's so wild to me that they put so much investment into a studio that, like, the main part of the company had no idea what was going on there for over 2 years and had to, like, physically show up to see it. And, like, yeah, they had, like, a couple tech demos. Like, I know there's some like Raven Blade, like a minute or two of like footage floating around the internet that you could find. So they definitely had something to show, but yeah, it wasn't even remotely close to their standards. And Miyamoto was like, oh, well, this is a perfect opportunity for this first Metroid game.
Well, see, something you just said really stuck out to me there, actually, and this stuck out to me while I was reading the article. So we have development that is floundering during the course of these 2 years. I'm wondering, I'm like, what took them so long to follow up with this studio that they've, invested a significant amount of money in? Like, I'm assuming that things are looking pretty good through 1998, maybe in the first half of 1999. But like, when you're not seeing anything, when you're not seeing any results, what takes you so long to get there? I mean, honestly, when you hear that the studio is developing 4 different games, doesn't that kind of send alarm bells ringing to you? And not only 4 different games, but like, these are 4 very different games that you can't even have any crossover on in terms of the engine. Like, you got a football game, you got a game where you're driving cars, you've got an RPG, and you've got presumably a third-person action-adventure game. Like, none of those are similar to each other at all. And, like, even actually going back further with what you said, like, when has Nintendo ever put out, like, a licensed sports game? Like, wouldn't that be like an alarm bell for them? Like, hey, they're working on this football game. That's not really something in our wheelhouse. Like, so it makes me wonder, and like, obviously Retro would have had to have shown them what they were working on. I can't imagine they were developing this football game in secret, unless it was kind of like an arcade style football game. I don't know, but there's a lot of really weird red flags here, and it makes me wonder why this meeting didn't happen sooner. Or maybe they were just so insignificant to Nintendo that it wasn't a priority. But it does seem strange to me that they invested money into this company, and the company is just bleeding money in terms of salary and production, and they're getting nothing for it, and they let it run for as long as they did.
Yeah, I think it's just a case of like the right hand not talking to the left. I mean, when you have a huge company like this, it's not uncommon to have one part of the company doing something that other parts have no idea what's going on. Nintendo of America probably made this deal and it was like, all right, Retro, you're good to go. And Nintendo of Japan probably had like an inkling of an idea of like what had happened and all of that. But, I can't imagine that they really had any other info other than what they got from Nintendo of America. And Nintendo of America isn't a big development or a branch or even a big part of branch of Nintendo overall, right? It's really, Nintendo of Japan is the big, huge part of it. So I'm not surprised that there wasn't a lot of communication, not a lot of follow-up. That's what I mean, it still happens today in 2020, where some parts of a company have no idea what's going on with another part of the company, or it's outsourced, and so they have to take care of it, this and that. I'm sure, like, Nintendo Japan, like, approved a deal for Nintendo of America and, like, a budget, and then Nintendo of America, like, moved that money and made the deal happen, but doesn't really have, like, an overseeing capacity, and Nintendo of Japan isn't directly, tied to the deal, so they weren't overseeing it. So it was kind of just a situation where, well, it's not my problem. Well, it's not my problem. Well, whose problem is it? And ended up, finally becoming Nintendo of Japan's because they had to go there physically. But I'm not surprised that that's how it went. I'm sure Nintendo had money to work with, and they were looking for new opportunities in game development. They were presented with a good one, and they decided to leap on it and kind of hope for the best and see how it would go down. And worst case scenario is what happened. But in another reality, it might have just gone great from the get-go, and it would have been seen as a genius move. It just so happened that's not what the case was.
It's strange to think about Nintendo of America in this, in this kind of situation, because half of me is wondering, like, they finally got some agency. They've went and they've acquired this studio and they've got this working relationship with them. I wonder if they weren't almost a little bit defensive of the studio, or maybe presenting them in a better light to Nintendo of Japan than maybe they actually should have been.
Yeah.
It's funny to think. And you know what? Honestly, not that much later after Metroid Prime, we have a new Nintendo of America president, Reggie Fils-Aimé. So it kind of makes you wonder, like, how this whole kind of deal affected the Nintendo of America structure, if it affected it at all. So interesting to think about. I believe Tatsumi Kimishima was still, I think he was still Nintendo of America president at the time. So interesting to see this all unfold. But it was a bloodbath apparently, and that's kind of like getting called into the principal's office when Nintendo of Japan is flying across the world to come and visit your studio. So Raven Blade, as everyone that's been following retro over the years knows, was canceled. It seems like every few years there's like rumors of retro kind of revisiting this idea and like remaking this game. It's kind of folklore at this point, but I would kind of like to see it just for to come full circle.
I think it's probably best remained in the past. Like, any elements of Raven Blade that we'd probably even want in the games were probably worked into other retro games. Like, as we know, a bunch of members from the Raven Blade team ended up working on Metroid Prime. So, and I'm sure they took some elements of that. And even looking from the gameplay footage, it actually kind of looked like a Zelda Hyrule Warriors kind of game, to be honest. Like this fantasy, like hack and slash RPG-ish looking kind of thing. Nothing very exciting or impressive.
It wasn't exciting, no, I don't think. But I think it would be kind of poetic to see like this game come out and like, it would obviously be completely different. I'm sure in every single aspect, but yeah, I don't know. It would kind of be poetic to me, and I've always been low key kind of rooting for it to make a resurgence one day.
See, I'm just waiting.
I want to read to you.
I'm sorry, but I'm just waiting for the football game to come out. That's what, I want them to release NFL Retro Football. Screw Raven Blade. Give me NFL Retro Football and Thunder Rally, which you remember you said.
I feel like that football game became Def Jam like football or whatever it ended up being.
And you said Thunder Rally might have been a Rocket League kind of game. What's the other like racing battle game, like the Sony one? Twisted Metal. That's what I always thought it was going to be. Yeah. I always thought it was going to be like a Nintendo Twisted Metal, which I thought would be a pretty cool idea. But I guess they did not agree.
Well, I mean, you already had Twisted Metal. I think it existed by that point, right? That was a PlayStation 1 game.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Like, I think they want to do like their own version of it, maybe for Nintendo Play. I don't know. I guess they didn't because they scrapped it. But who knows?
Nah, who knows? I want to read to you a quote that really stuck out to me, and you kind of mentioned it earlier. We're like, why are they trusting the studio that has no results to their name with such a big franchise such as Metroid? So this line stuck out to me like a sore thumb. Quote, one thing unclear to the developers we talked to is why exactly Miyamoto and Nintendo of Japan trusted Retro with a new take on the Metroid IP. They could only speculate. Miyamoto doesn't like the Metroid series in terms of the old Metroids. He doesn't get them. Those aren't the types of games he likes to play, an anonymous former Retro employee said. At the end of the day, I don't know what the decision was that made them trust us, because there really wasn't much for us to be trusted on. In Japan, Metroid was never really a big thing. It was more of a big thing over here. We all know that, but it still stings to read that in print, does it not?
Not really. I can't really expect everybody to like every kind of thing, or even Metroid. And I guess it's just because
we're not talking everybody though. This is like the godfather of video games, man. This is Shigeru Miyamoto. To hear he doesn't like Super Metroid or Metroid,
but he likes Metroid Prime, baby. Woo! Let's go. I don't know. I guess it's because I don't.
It almost like hurt my feelings almost, or made me sad that like my idol didn't love one of my favorite video games.
I see. I don't consider Miyamoto like an idol of mine, and I don't really like tie my identity too hard to video games. So it's like it's not an offense to me that someone of his caliber doesn't like it or not. It doesn't know it has no effect on me. Does it suck because it affects like their development of one of my favorite franchises? Sure. But this is also again, like you said, this is stuff that we've known for so long that even now I'm desensitized to it. So for me to like really give you an objective answer, I kind of can't. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think that's okay. Like Miyamoto is not gonna love every type of game, and I understand where he's coming from. It's not like a Super Mario Brothers. It's not a Legend of Zelda. It wasn't even like a Kid Icarus. So, and it isn't big in Japan. So I don't know. I think that's okay. I'm glad that he had the idea though to do a first person shooter because for FPS games, at least at the time and still today, really aren't a huge genre in Japan either. So that he at least liked that and thought of that idea, I think is cool because it still shows that he had some interest in it. He still showed that he had some awareness of what was gaining traction and popularity at the time in the whole industry. And going back to the quote of I don't know what the decision was that made them trust us. I think this was pretty obvious why they gave it to Retro. Number one, they're a Western studio, and FPS games were gaining traction, way more popular in the West than in the East. And two, they had a new studio that was very malleable that they could do essentially whatever they wanted with. So if they were going to take a new IP or do something new, this is a perfect opportunity. A bunch of resources not doing anything because they just canceled all these other games. It's in the West. They now have given them a bunch of focus and all of that and trimmed the fat. To go through the red tape of getting another studio together and Nintendo of Japan development studios weren't going to do it. So I thought this made a lot of sense to give it to Retro. Like, sure, they didn't have the track record, but the context and the situation, the scenario that they were in made Retro probably the best pick they had at the time, and it gave them something to do now that they cancel all this stuff. Whether or not Miyamoto liked 2D Metroids doesn't really affect me or bother me, and I don't really care. But I thought it was cool how he was on the zeitgeist. He knew what was going to be popular. He knew what would be a good idea, and gave it to, I think, one of the best possible choices.
I mean, at the time, you'd look at it and say like, this is one of the worst possible choices, though.
Well, yeah, in
See,
hindsight, I
I'm a little
mean.
bit more cynical. Well, in hindsight, sure, but like, I feel like I'm more cynical on this because in my mind, I'm like, okay, so Miyamoto doesn't like Metroid. We all knew that, but that still stings. It's like when your grandmother says that you don't like your home cooked meal, that you've been trying to perfect her recipe or something like that. So he doesn't like it. That's fine. He he's going to give it to a Western studio that's bleeding money, mismanaged. They just want to get some kind of return for their investment. Here's Metroid, make us a game. Obviously, I don't want to say that they wouldn't have cared if it was good or not, but I think that objective number one was to get something from this studio,
Yeah.
some kind of return for their investment. And I think that honestly is the case where it's like, okay, here's a franchise that we have, it's not near and dear to our hearts, work on it and, give us something that we can sell to justify us paying you for the last, 2-3 years at this point. See, I think that's more so why they got Metroid rather than it was, they had this grand idea to make to lean into Western kind of developers to make first-person shooter games because I don't really think that was the case. Either way, like at the time, it just seems like such a bizarre pick. I mean, obviously in hindsight, we know that it worked out, splendidly, but just I can't imagine the thought process in 2000 after laying off half your studio, canceling 3 games, saying like, yeah, you've got to get this game out in 2 years.
I mean, it's probably a combination of the two. I do think that they had, like, Miyamoto was aware of like the trends in Western gaming, but at the same time, they probably didn't care that much. Like, hey, whatever. Like, if they're not successful, we'll close the studio, and it's whatever. They didn't make a Metroid game. Like, I'm sure they didn't really care that much. It wasn't like a huge priority. It wasn't like a huge weight off their shoulders or anything to do this. They're like, yeah, let's see what happens. It's not like they were making a Zelda game or a Mario game or Pokemon game or whatever it is. Um,
It almost seems like they were willing
like, whatever.
to bet on like this being an other M kind of a game where it's like, okay, well if this sucks, then whatever, it's a one and done. But if
Yeah.
it's good, then maybe we have something.
Yeah.
So very interesting to think about here. Let's move on to another part of our story that you alluded to earlier. The history of Retro Studios is unfortunately the history of Jeff Spangenberg, as he so awesomely called him. This guy seems like such a tool. He very much flaunts his wealth in your face. He was laying his staff off as he was driving his Ferrari to work. He would allegedly poach talent from Acclaim because he was sour about being laid off, and then send like gifts to their HR representative in a mocking way. He would disappear for like months or even a year at a time during like the really crunch periods, and most most un-Nintendo like, he ran what could be described as kind of a soft pornography website called Sinful Summer, where he would post pictures of his private pool parties that he had at his house. And he ran this website using the Retro Studio IP server. Oh boy. Yikes. and
Legend.
There was also rumors, unfound rumors. I don't think these were ever proven, but there were rumors that employees were embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars. What is going on here?
Yeah, that's probably pretty embellished. I'm not surprised, and I think it's pretty likely that some money was embezzled. Like, clearly there was money being used for non-game development purposes throughout Retro's history, but hundreds of thousands of dollars is that's a lot of money to like just go missing, especially in game development 20 years ago. So I don't think they would have gotten away with hundreds of thousands of dollars being embezzled, but tens of thousands. Yes, I do think that could happen. And I mean, considering that the Spangenberg guy was very obviously using his money and likely some Retro money to do this kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that's probably has some truth to it, even though it might not be entirely true. And obviously there's no real evidence to confirm that. Not that if there was, we'd be able to easily find it anyway, like 20 years ago, or 20 years from then, maybe even 10 years from then. But yeah, that sounds like a studio that, again, doesn't have a lot of guidance. The guy who's running it, shows up once every few months and spends most of his days driving around in his car and hosting pool parties on weekdays at his place, which again, hey, if I could host pool parties on weekdays, on work days, I'd do it. I'd figure out a way to do it. I might not run a porn website from my company, IP address.
This guy's house made me think of, so me and my fiance just finished watching Animal Kingdom, where they have like a pool party like every day, and I'm just thinking like, dude, this must be what this guy's house was like on a Wednesday afternoon or something like that. Just like, what a crazy story. I agree. I think hundreds of thousands of dollars is kind of pushing it. Like it's kind of one of those things where like there's a line and one kid whispers to the next kid one number and he whispers to the next kid, and by the end of the line, like the number is like $1 bajillion or something like that. But I could totally see funds being misappropriated to potentially prop up this website business that he had going on. But like, he just seemed like such a sleazeball. None of his former employees had anything good to say about him, and executive very un-Nintendo like. Nintendo's this family friendly company, and this guy just completely flies in the face of that. And it wasn't long before Nintendo basically bought him out of his own company. They purchased the remainder of his stock in Retro Studios for $1 million. I don't know if that seems like too much or if it seems like a bargain, but they paid just to get this guy out of the company. And we'll visit him later in the story and follow up with him. But what a story, and what a personality to have in your small team at this point. It just flies in the face of what we think of Nintendo. It seems unbelievable to me.
That's a lot of the time how these things work. You have this like cult of personality around one person who, in spite of many negative things, was able to get the ball rolling. I mean, without this guy, you wouldn't have Retro, you wouldn't have Metroid Prime, but at the cost of a bunch of other things. So, a lot of people don't get wealthy just by being a good guy, or being a good person. You gotta step on some people and make some morally questionable things, and that's pretty much an understatement for this guy. So I honestly, I was looking back at this, I was like, only $1 million. Like, I'm surprised. It was one of the situations, I think, how this was written, that like he either took that deal or like he wasn't getting another deal, and I'm sure he realized, like, he saw the writing on the wall and he's like, I should probably get out while I'm ahead.
It very much sounds like he was basically going to be fired.
Yeah.
Or as close to fired as you can be.
Either that or Nintendo would have done something to like make it so that he would have been, or the entire studio would have been ineffective. So I think right there he had an out and he took it. probably the smartest decision he would make, and certainly burned a lot of bridges. But hey, he hit that triple comma club or whatever it is, double comma club. However, I don't know how many zeros are in it, but he got that, and he was already wealthy, so certainly got out with a good amount of money. While you saw people getting laid off and losing their jobs. I think there's one part in the story where he like shows up for the layoffs like in his Ferrari as people like half the company's getting laid off. Like the guy clearly didn't care about his fellow peer, if you even consider them peers at all. You sometimes need that kind of that crazy immoral person, not need, but sometimes it takes that crazy immoral person to like actually make this kind of stuff happen. Now, could Metroid Prime have been made without all of this? Maybe, probably. But it is interesting to see like how you have this like one person who is really the engine behind it all at the beginning and has this kind of cult of personality behind them, which, like as you said, flew in the face of what Nintendo was known for and strove for and what their image was based on. And certainly, I would have to think that when they made that visit to Retro Studios, that they had some kind of an idea of what kind of person he was, and then they learned much more after that.
I feel like their visit to the studio was essentially to see what they had, get rid of everything that they didn't need. I'm sure that the motions were in works like before Nintendo Japan ever set foot in America to get rid of this guy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, wild story, and it gets even wilder. The new Retro Studios boss is a guy named Steve Garcia, and this guy, to his credit, he finished and he shipped Metroid Prime, but apparently he just worked everybody there into the ground. They were working 12, 13, 14, 16-hour days. One employee said he worked for 48 hours straight. They got it out, but at the expense of everybody at Retro Studios. And the game had already been delayed a couple of different times at this point, so this really was crunch time. But this kind of seemed like something above and beyond. You can bet that if this was happening in 2020, there would be an expose about it.
There'd be a Kotaku article written immediately.
Oh, yeah.
We'd have that long form editorial. Oh, for sure. And as much as I love Metroid Prime, nothing is worth, crunching human lives to death. It is,
I mean, if this game launched in 2003, it's still going to be amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So, but, it is what it is. The reality of the situation is that's how it went down, and we ended up getting a great game from it, but at the cost of, a really awful way of doing business. And that is, a reality we see in the games industry time and time and time again. We just recently saw it with The Last of Us and Naughty Dog, and I'm sure there are multiple cases of crunch and poor business practice happening as we speak right now for some AAA or now they're quadruple A games that are being made now. Yeah, it's I remember, I think in one part of the article they said, as a quote, it's like this awful sociopathic way of doing business, but that's what happened. We just had some really good, really, really smart people that knew how to execute on the team by the end of it. So it did hone the team like a sharp knife there being worked to death, and it created an absolute masterpiece of a game. But it is really, it is unfortunate to read back and see, you don't remember those specific developers who put, like you said, multiple days at a time and hours and hours and hours of their lives into a really small period of time to create, what is just a form of entertainment for us that is not necessary. That's a privilege, to play and to have and to be able to have the time to play it and run it or whatever it is. At the cost of people who worked really hard, were probably underpaid or probably overworked, who were definitely overworked, who were definitely underpaid. And to, read back on it, it sucks because you have this guy who is super wealthy and gets to reap the rewards of it, so to speak. And of course, Nintendo certainly did and still does to this day, whether or not they even acknowledge the games at this point. But there are people who were grinded to dust making this game, as they were for Echoes and for other games that have been made throughout time, and you kind of now get to see the light of it, but during when it's happening, it sucks. You can't really, be there for those people or make those conditions better, even though it does return sometimes some really great products.
Well, the story gets worse before it gets better. Before we move on, this is another quote that stuck out to me that kind of confirms, or at least kind of gives some weight to this, something that we were talking about earlier, Dak. Quote, one team member says they heard years later Nintendo planned to shut Retro down after Metroid Prime's launch, finally getting a game from it and cutting its losses afterwards. But then the game launched and it was a hit. So it very much like seems to me that if this had went the way of Other M and it was just a not very good game, we wouldn't have a Retro Studios. We wouldn't have gotten the Prime Trilogy or the new Donkey Kongs or Metroid Prime 4, whatever else that they've done over the years. So it's very interesting to see how history can weave and woe. But yeah, you were mentioning the employees of Retro were overworked and underpaid. One thing that Retro did to kind of rebuild morale is they implemented a royalty program based off the game's sales. So they went through and they devised kind of a distribution method to make sure that everybody had a fair percentage of the royalties go to them. Everyone from the senior executives, who obviously would get a little bit more, but not an absurd amount more, down to every junior artist and whatnot. A lot of the team members at Retro said that they had a really fair distribution system, but then our boy Steve Garcia came in and completely reshook up, changed the whole thing. He blew it all up, and he changed it so that all of the royalties went to the top executives, and like the bare scrap minimum went down to the rank and file who had just broken their back for the last year making this game. And to make matters even worse is accounting sent out this distribution to the entire studio so everybody could see how much the executives were making compared to how much they were making. This is another thing that is just unbelievable to me. This seems like, how does this happen in a place of business?
I'm, again, not surprised. I feel like this is so common in so many workplaces, and Steve Garcia was the one who replaced Spangenberg. He was the then vice president of product and development, and he was like the similar but different to Spangenberg. Spangenberg like created the team, but he and created a pretty poor working situation in terms of like there was way too much ambition. They were working on too many games and engine and all that stuff, and then he just leaves. And you have this guy who now you have a more focused studio, but this guy is focused, Steve Garcia, entirely on the
laser focused.
On the end product, right? Which again results in the same grinding down of people, and of course, just to see that like realizing how much people were actually making from that and having that all sent out to the entire company, that is a morale Spartan laser that just destroys your entire existence. And it sucks, especially for, because the people who do the hardest work are those who are at the lower ends of the bottom part of the barrel for very often.
Of course.
So to see that.
And in any medium, that's the truth.
Almost in every industry, almost in anything ever. It's always, the people at the bottom that are doing the most work and getting the least, the least out of it. So, yeah, I mean, that was, in the article they say for many, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Absolutely, it was. And I couldn't, if I was working there, I would be very hard pressed to like be able to not even just continue, but like put my all into whatever I'm working on,
It's just crazy to me that like this was public, and that this was released to the studio. Like, if you're gonna screw your employees, like, keep it a secret, right? Like, it just seems like such a backwards move for this Mr. Garcia to make, and for all of his faults, he seemed like he at least had a good head on his shoulders. He got everybody working and finished, and he looked like he at least had a plan. Mm-hmm. So it just seems like such a weird move for him to make. But you said it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, and allegedly, basically every employee at Retro Studios was essentially going to walk out on Garcia and Retro, and Nintendo got a hold of this and we're just like, no, we will fix this. And they parted ways with Garcia basically to save or to stop this mutiny from happening. He was replaced with Michael Kelbach. Is that how you'd say his name? Kelbach?
Michael Kelbach? I think it's Kelbach.
Yeah. So Kelbach was working as Nintendo's director of business development at the time, and his run seemed to be what finally kind of stabilized Retro Studios. Of course, them having a working engine helped as well, but like,
Hmm.
he got there and kind of steered the ship towards the Metroid Prime sequels and everything else that we got. I didn't research how long his reign actually lasted, but he did, at least at the time, seem to finally bring a sense of stability and leadership to the studio. So it was a long road to get there, and a lot of crazy stuff ended up happening. But Retro did it, and of course, as we know, Metroid Prime goes out and is one of the best reviewed games ever, and we're still talking about it almost 20 years later. So it just goes to show that, like, even when you have this incredibly troubled development with this incredibly extenuating set of circumstances, you can still pull some gold out of that. So it's just a crazy story to me.
Yeah, and I believe Kelbaugh is still the president and CEO of Retro Studios to this day. So
Wow.
I met him in 2014, I believe, at E3 for the Smash Invitational, and he was like, "If you're ever in Austin, Texas, let me know. I'll give you a tour of Retro Studio." I was like, "Oh, great!" And I never ever I've never been to Texas.
Oh, buddy, when do we fly into Austin, Texas? What are
I
we
have his
doing?
business card right in my hands right now.
Let's
So I
go.
have his direct line and cell and his email. And I'm not gonna share it, obviously, but I have it. So whenever you want to make that trip, whenever the pandemic's over, I'll be like, "Hey, man, remember when we met 6 years ago? They still is that still a good offer?" But clearly that was a good move because the guy's been working there for almost over a decade and a half, almost 2 decades now, and Retro is seeing way more success since then. So it was probably a pretty good move to bring my man Cowboy in.
All right, so some real quick epilogue here. Steve Garcia, after he was let go from Retro, would go on to work with Electronic Arts, and he was working on some of the Def Jam games. I bet you that football game surfaced in that, because weren't there a bunch of like Def Jam like basketball games and stuff like that?
Hmm. Uh,
I bet
I don't know actually.
I bet you the DNA of that kind of made its way over there. I don't know. It doesn't matter. More interestingly, Spangenberg went on to found Top Heavy Studios, developer of the adult-orientated trivia game The Guy Game, infamous for featuring live-action footage of women taking their tops off during spring break. And fittingly enough,
Oh,
in 2004, this slimeball got sued by an underage girl for featuring her in the game. So, don't know what happened to him then. It sounds like he's kind of disappeared from the public eye.
yeah. That's well. You got to have that two two
Good
five seven. You
riddance.
got to have them sign that 2257. That's so it works in the cable and TV industry. 2257's like the legal. Like, hey, everyone in this production is of age, and we have proof of that. My man's to not get the 2257. So you got to make sure that's always there. And actually, it's nice looking back. This article actually came out 2 years ago, but before my birthday on the 29th. But looking back at this article, it's funny how it's aged because at the end of the article they write, according to reports, the company Retro is currently working on a Star Fox retro racing game called Star Fox Grand Prix. Remember that? We all thought that there was going to be a racing Star Fox game coming out, and that apparently was, or even that, or another game was going through a rocky development cycle that ended up being canceled. Goes all the way back to the beginning of Retro where there was some kind of rocky development cycle involved, and then they were involved somehow. And then, of course, we go all the way back to current times, Metroid Prime 4, rocky development cycle, and who ends up being involved? Retro Studios. So whether it's a blessing or a curse, they're somehow always getting their hands dirty in something that's already pretty muddy. And I very much doubt that the Star Fox Grand Prix game is ever coming. I doubt we'll ever see Spangenberg again. But I don't doubt that we'll see some great games from at least one more great game from Retro. But as I said at the beginning of this, it's a completely different studio. McKelbor might still be there, but the teams are all different. I believe majority of the people involved in even Metroid Prime 3 are gone by now potentially. Maybe they don't even work in the industry anymore. They work somewhere else. And at the end of the article, to round things out, they were talking about 3/4 of the people you would talk to had a really awful experience in terms of developing Metroid Prime or their time at the studio. It's not a blast being anywhere near any of the layoffs. There's a lot of negativity there, but I put out one of the best games they're ever going to make. The people they worked with were some of the most talented people they were going to work with. So there's always a bright side, and of course we end up getting Metroid Prime, which is the best Metroid game ever made. So, there's always some kind of bright side to it. There's always a diamond in the rough, but it is crazy to look back. I wouldn't say it's an unbelievable story, because now that what we know about crunch and working conditions in the industry, especially with how popular social media and the internet is these days, and how quickly word spreads, and how news spreads, and all of these articles being written, I don't think it's unbelievable to see this, but it is unbelievable how all of that wrapped up together to make one of the most iconic games ever made, one of the most critically acclaimed trilogies ever made, and made for a pretty interesting story at the end, which we then all comes down to being read about and talked about on the Omega Metroid podcast, where everything comes to a center. It is, of course, the focal point of the world and the industry. So I'm glad we were able to go through this, because it is my favorite Metroid game, and living a little bit of how it was made is always interesting to me.
I think that it's an unbelievable story. Not that there are studios out there crunching employees or like having really shady business practices. To me, the unbelievable part is that this happened under the umbrella of Nintendo, which is
that's true.
Such a structured company that it's crazy to think that this happened under their watch. Mm-hmm. So it's just very out of character. And, it's just the unbelievable part too, is that from all this chaos, we got one of the greatest video games ever made, which, a lot of troubled developments have led to really terrible games. And you can kind of trace those troubled developments and look and see, okay, that's why this game turned out like this. But Metroid Prime seemed to defy all of those odds. And it gives me hope for Metroid Prime 4, because, we've kind of come full circle almost back to where we started way back when, at the beginning of Retro Studios. So, it's kind of poetic, I think. And, I'm glad that we got to talk about this today.
It's definitely poetic, and maybe I can't wait for Metroid Prime 4. I really hope, though, that we're not in another, rocky development situation. Maybe that's what it takes to make a good Metroid Prime game, though. Maybe we need a little bit of crunch. We need some rocky development. We need Ferraris and softcore porn sites and pool parties to make a good Metroid Prime game. And I guess we'll have to find out. Again, I really cannot wait until we learn the truth of how Metroid Prime 4 has been developed. There has to be a ton of stuff that's behind the scenes, and we have no idea what's happening. The game has been, quote unquote, in development for years now, and we literally haven't seen a split second, a frame of gameplay. We haven't even seen anything involving the game at all. We don't even know if that's the actual title. We haven't seen Samus, Ridley, nothing. So I really hope
we're gonna have to wait like 10 years to learn what happened.
Yeah, if you're out there, if you're listening,
but it's gonna be worth the wait.
If one of you works at Retro right now and is listening to this show, my DMs are open. If you got a screenshot, I won't share it. I might share it with Andy, but I won't share it. I just show me something, man, or whoever, a man, woman, whoever. Show me what you got. I need something. I need it directly in my vein. We got Hyrule Warriors today. Maybe I don't want Metroid Warriors, but I do want some kind of Metroid news. But this is a good story, and it really goes back to like how things have changed in a way, but they really haven't. And again, like you said, it is unbelievable that this happened under the umbrella of the watch of Nintendo. But at the same time, it almost didn't happen under the watch of Nintendo, because they weren't watching half the time. That's kind of why it was able to go so rampant and out of control. And if they didn't step in, who knows what would have happened? Who knows what would have happened to Retro Studios? Who knows if Metroid Prime would have happened at all? But I will say, I think if Retro went under or it didn't go well, I do think we would have gotten Metroid Prime at the end of the day, because it really does go back to Miyamoto being like, a Metroid first-person shooter game is something that should be made, or was an idea, or a vision, or something, a consideration by the guy, enough for him to put the faith in this untested, out-of-control studio. Maybe if it wasn't Retro, it would have gone to someone who might have been more competent looking at the time, would have been as good. Who knows? It probably could have been. Probably might, maybe not. But it is wild to see how, things could have been different had Miyamoto not made that trip, or Retro didn't end up getting the Metroid IP, or if their version of it failed or whatever. We can only speculate, but it is interesting to think how it could have gone down. But true reality is often stranger than fiction, and we certainly got a pretty wild
That's right.
story from what actually happened.
Well, and I can't wait for 18 years down the line when we're recording episode 2000 or whatever it's going to be about the development of Metroid Prime 4. All right, well, that's going to do it for us. I am crossing my fingers that we get some kind of shadow drop Metroid announcement. Maybe it's a trilogy. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a new 2D game. Maybe it's a remake of something. I don't know. I'd take anything at this point.
Absolutely.
So fingers crossed. News is coming fast and furious. We're going to get out of here. Dak, is there any parting words that you want to say before we skedaddle?
I've got really nothing. Just be sure to check me out on Twitch at DaxCity_. I'm definitely going to be playing some more Metroid soon. Andy, I got to have you on so we can do some Metroid stuff soon. I got to help you out. Get into the Twitchosphere, man. It'll be great. I'm sure you love it.
Well, start playing some Metroid. Last time I checked, you were playing the worst 3D Mario game, Mario
Sunshine.
Sunshine.
God, dude, Sunshine is so good, okay? I don't know what you have, this hatred for what is clearly the best 3D Mario game.
We better continue
Super
this
Mario
conversation
64
off
wishes
air.
it was Sunshine, and I'll stick to it. You're right, I do got to stream some more of that. But yeah, it has been fun, and that's all I've got for you.
All right, well, we hope that you guys had fun listening to this tale of Retro Studios. We want you to check us out over on Twitter at Omega Metroid Pod. I am at Spateri316. Dak is at DakCity_. And we want you to check us out over on Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. Like and subscribe to the Omega Metroid Podcast. Tell a Metroid fan in your life. And we will see you guys next week. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you then.